The night Rwanda fell apart. April 7, 1994, Kigali, Rwanda. The night air was heavy with the smell of rain and fear. A faint radio crackled through the dark, its static broken by a trembling voice announcing the impossible. The plane carrying President Juvenal Habyarimana had been shot down. The flames from the wreckage lit up the horizon, and in that instant, the country ignited with it. On the ground, in the narrow streets of Nyamirambo, the sound of machetes scraping against the pavement drowned out the usual hum of the city. Neighbors who once shared meals now stared at each other with suspicion that had been simmering for decades. In less than an hour, roadblocks went up. ID cards became death sentences. The orders were chillingly clear. The Interahamwe militias, young men armed with cheap weapons, rage, and cheap biro, began their hunt. The targets were the Tutsi population, and anyone who dared to hide them. In homes across Kigali, families huddled in silence, praying the knock on the door would never come. In churches, once sacred places of refuge, people packed shoulder to shoulder, not realizing that many of these sanctuaries would soon become graves. The genocide had begun. By dawn, rivers ran red. Entire hillsides burned as smoke coiled above the valleys. Over the radio, propaganda called for work to be finished, a coded message for slaughter. The world listened and did nothing. In the United Nations compound, Major General Romeo Dallaire of the UN peacekeeping missions staring at his radio, his requests for reinforcements denied again and again. He had barely 2,500 men, too few, too restricted, too late. We were supposed to keep the peace, he muttered, but there was no peace left to keep. Outside those compound walls, Rwanda was collapsing. Nearly 1 million people would die in just 100 days, an extermination so fast and so intimate that the very soil seemed to absorb the screams. But amid the horror, in the northern hills, a quiet resistance was gathering. A former rebel army, led by a man named Paul Kagame, began its march toward the capital. He wasn't fighting for revenge, he was fighting to stop the madness. And when the killing finally ended, what was left was a silence more haunting than the violence itself. A country of ghosts, a land without trust. A name synonymous with tragedy. Yet in that silence, beneath the ruins, beneath the grief, something began to stir. A determination to rebuild. Not just to survive, but to redefine what Rwanda could be. A country of ashes. July 1994, Kigali was a graveyard. Streets once alive with market chatter were lined with skulls and twisted bicycles. The air was thick with rot. Bodies still lay in shallow ditches, unburied. The war was over, but nothing felt like victory. Paul Kagame and the Rwandan Patriotic Front had seized the capital, ending the genocide. But what they found wasn't a nation, it was ruin. More than 1 million people dead, 2 million fled into neighboring countries. Infrastructure destroyed, institutions gone. The very idea of Rwanda barely existed. Hospitals had no doctors, schools had no teachers. The government had no staff, most civil servants were either killed, fled, or complicit in the killing. Even the money in circulation had become worthless, soaked in blood and dust. Kagame walked through the wreckage in silence, his soldiers watching the horizon with hollow eyes. The victory felt hollow, the world had abandoned them, and now rebuilding would have to begin without it. In refugee camps across the border in Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, chaos brewed again. Among the innocent Hutu civilians were the same militia leaders who had orchestrated the genocide, men now arming themselves to strike back. Rwanda was trapped between its grief and its fear. But inside the wrecked parliament building in Kigali, Kagame and a handful of survivors began to outline a plan, not for revenge, but for resurrection. "We cannot live in the past," he said quietly. "We have to become something else." It was a statement that would define Rwanda's future. Step 1 was order. The new government banned ethnic identification. No more Hutu, no more Tutsi, no more dividing lines. Everyone would simply be Rwandan. It sounded idealistic, even naive. But for a country that had seen how identity could become a weapon, it was survival. Step 2 was justice, but justice that would not consume the nation in bitterness. There were over 100,000 genocide suspects in prisons built for a fraction of that. The formal court system would take decades. So Rwanda turned to something ancient, Gacaca. These were community courts, open-air gatherings where survivors and perpetrators faced each other. Truth was spoken, forgiveness was attempted, and sentences were decided by the very neighbors who had once lived side by side. It was imperfect, painful, and raw, but it was real. Step 3 was unity through rebuilding. Kagame's government outlawed corruption with an almost military precision. Roads were cleared, schools reopened. Women, who had lost husbands, fathers, and sons, stepped into positions of leadership. By the early 2000s, Rwanda had one of the highest percentages of women in parliament anywhere in the world. Still, the outside world doubted. Aid agencies whispered that the country would collapse again. Economists predicted famine. But Rwanda had something far stronger than resources or sympathy. It had collective will. Each month, citizens took part in Umuganda, a national cleanup day where everyone from farmers to government ministers worked together to clean streets, plant trees, or repair roads. It wasn't symbolic, it was culture, a reminder that progress would not come from handouts, but from hands joined. Slowly, brick by brick, Rwanda began to look less like a wound and more like a nation. But the real transformation, the one that would shock the world, was still to come. The rise of a new Rwanda. By the early 2000s, Kigali no longer looked like the city of ghosts it once was. The bullet holes on government walls had been plastered over. Streets were clean, orderly, safe. The chaos of the past had been replaced with a sense of discipline so precise it almost felt unnatural. Rwanda was rebuilding, not in the image of foreign donors or colonial models, but in its own reflection. Kagame, now president, made it clear, "We are not here to beg. We are here to build." His leadership style was unapologetically firm. Some called it authoritarian. Others called it necessary. Either way, it worked. While many African nations drowned in corruption and mismanagement, Rwanda developed a reputation for zero tolerance. Even high-ranking ministers could be fired or jailed for taking bribes. The message was clear. Discipline wasn't optional, it was national policy. Foreign investors, initially cautious, began to take notice. Roads were paved with clockwork precision, bureaucracy was streamlined. Business registration that once took months could now be done in hours. Kigali became one of the cleanest capitals in Africa, a city where littering was a crime and order was a civic duty. Behind the scenes, Rwanda's transformation was strategic. Kagame's team studied the rise of Singapore, another small nation that had risen from chaos to prosperity through discipline, technology, and education. Rwanda adapted that model to its context. They called it Vision 2020. The goal was clear: transform Rwanda from an agricultural economy into a knowledge-based one. The government invested heavily in infrastructure, fiber optic cables, energy grids, airports, and tech hubs. Education shifted toward science and entrepreneurship. The capital became a testing ground for innovation, from drone delivery of medical supplies to cashless payment systems that reached even rural farmers. But perhaps Rwanda's most remarkable shift was psychological. The same nation once torn apart by division now made unity its most valuable export. National slogans, "We are one people, never again," weren't just words on posters. They were woven into schools, institutions, and everyday conversation. Women led much of this transformation. They chaired councils, ran companies, and drafted new laws. Many had lost everything in 1994. Now they were rebuilding what men had destroyed. Rwanda became the first nation in the world where women held more than half the seats in parliament. Still, the past never vanished. Beneath the polished streets and economic growth, the memory of genocide lingered like a shadow. Kigali's genocide memorial stood as both a warning and a promise that progress would never erase pain, but perhaps it could give it purpose. Internationally, Rwanda's image began to shift. Once a symbol of tragedy, it became a case study in recovery. Delegations from across Africa arrived to study its governance. Global institutions called it Africa's Singapore. Investors described it as the cleanest, safest place to do business in Africa. But Rwanda's rise came with control. Freedom of speech remained limited. Political opposition was tightly managed. Kagame's rule, though efficient, was absolute. Critics argued that the country's order was built on fear, that beneath the shining skyline, dissent was quietly silenced. Yet for most Rwandans, after what they'd endured, peace, even imperfect peace, was worth protecting. By the mid-2010s, Rwanda's GDP had grown at one of the fastest rates in Africa. The streets of Kigali shimmered under LED lights. Wi-Fi filled public buses, startups were blooming. And from the hills that once echoed with screams came the hum of progress. The world looked on, amazed. How could a nation once synonymous with death become a symbol of rebirth? The answer was simple and complex. Rwanda had learned what it meant to lose everything. And because of that, it refused to waste anything again. The price of progress. By 2020, Rwanda had become a symbol of what discipline and vision could achieve. Towering cranes dotted the Kigali skyline, conferences and tech summits replaced refugee camps. Tourists arrived to hike volcanic mountains and visit gorillas in misty jungles once known for bloodshed. But behind the polished image lay a quiet tension, the question of what Rwanda had to sacrifice to become the Singapore of Africa. Paul Kagame's leadership had delivered results that even his critics couldn't deny: low corruption, high literacy, reliable power, clean streets, and consistent growth. But it came through tight control. The press was monitored. Political opposition was nearly non-existent. Many Rwandans spoke of unity, but rarely of politics. At village meetings, called Umuganda, citizens discussed community goals and national pride, not dissent. There was little room for criticism in a country where order had become a kind of religion. For Kagame, stability wasn't just policy, it was survival. He had seen what chaos looked like, he'd lived it. He wasn't going to let it return, yet for all its control, Rwanda's development model was stunningly effective. The nation invested heavily in healthcare and education, slashing child mortality and raising life expectancy by decades. Foreign investors built hotels, data centers, and coffee processing plants. Rwandan coffee and tea began appearing in Starbucks and Whole Foods. Even the country's approach to environmental policy stood out. Plastic bags were banned nationwide long before most Western countries followed suit. Urban design emphasized green spaces and cleanliness, turning Kigali into one of the most sustainable cities in Africa. Still, some voices whispered that Rwanda's success was fragile, dependent on Kagame's iron will. "What happens when he's gone?" a Western diplomat once asked quietly. "Can the system survive without the man?" Kagame's answer, delivered in his usual calm tone, was simple: institutions will speak for themselves, and in many ways, they already were. Rwanda's public sector ran with the precision of a corporation. Annual performance contracts, known as imihigo, held every official accountable, from ministers to mayors. Goals were set, results measured, and failures exposed. It wasn't democracy in the Western sense, but it was governance that worked. To the average Rwandan, what mattered wasn't freedom of speech, it was the ability to walk safely at night, send children to school, and trust that tomorrow might be better than yesterday. After 1994, that was more than enough. But progress carried weight. Beneath the surface, survivors still carried trauma. Entire generations grew up in a country that refused to talk about ethnicity, but could never forget it. Reconciliation was ongoing, fragile, and deeply personal. In small towns, survivors and perpetrators often worked side by side, one mixing cement, the other laying bricks. They built homes on the same land where their families had destroyed each other. It wasn't forgiveness in a religious sense, it was survival. By the time Rwanda hosted the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in 2022, the transformation was complete. Leaders who once ignored the country now came to learn from it. Kagame stood before them, a man who had led his nation from horror to hope, saying, "We may be a small country, but we have big ambitions." The world applauded. But behind those polite smiles was disbelief. Disbelief that a place once written off as doomed had risen so fast, so cleanly, and so defiantly. Rwanda's story wasn't one of miracles, it was one of choices, painful, relentless choices made every day for nearly 3 decades. And as the sun set over the rolling green hills, it was clear, Rwanda hadn't just rebuilt its buildings, it had rebuilt its soul. If this story moved you, remember, nations aren't defined by what destroys them, but by what they choose to build after. Subscribe for more untold stories of resilience, power, and transformation.